Good morning, everyone. My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I am Associate Director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University. Welcome this morning to our virtual legislative staff training. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Thanks for being here. Okay, it's 9:33, and I know that our presenters have other business of the day to conduct as well. Again, I want to thank everyone for participating today in IPSR's virtual legislative staff training. My name is Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. And I want to thank Cindy Kyle of our staff as well for helping put this together. Today we have two sessions of our training. The first right now, which is on budget and consensus revenue estimating conference. And then we will go till about 11 o'clock. Then we will end and pick it back up at 1 o'clock with presenters on the coronavirus and COVID-19, presenting on testing and contact tracing. So that should be of interest as well. Let me put up a screen of tips for you all. So you all are muted. I've muted all the participants. When you have a question, feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring both. And we'd appreciate, you can ask questions along the way. And as I said, we'll be monitoring both. Again, here is our agenda for this morning. With us is Marianne Cleary, Director of the Michigan House Fiscal Agency, Chris Harkins, Director of the Senate Fiscal Agency, and Dr. Charlie Ballard, Professor of Economics at Michigan State University and Director of the IPSR State of the State Survey. So I think with that, we'll get started. And I believe, Chris, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thanks, Arnold. Good morning, everybody. It's a dreary Monday morning here outside my window. Hopefully somebody's got some sun, but I don't know. So speaking of dreary, we held our revenue consensus conference on Friday, which I think is where Arnold would really like us to start. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I think most folks are probably quite familiar at this point, but if you're unfamiliar, the Revenue Conference is a at least twice annual meeting where both Marianne and I, as directors of the House and Senate Fiscal Agency, meet with a representative of the administration, either the treasurer or the budget director, sometimes both. Get together in January and in May, as required by statute, to determine the revenue estimates for the state. It's a fairly unique process, or initially was a unique process when it started, in that, you know, Michigan has essentially 3 unelected individuals serving in these capacities, determining what the revenue numbers will be so that the elected officials can make their policy decisions. It's a very good process. It's one that I think has been mimicked around the country now. And it's one that we just wrapped up on Friday. So we'll walk through a little bit of where we landed. Arnold, I'm going to try to share my screen here, and we can um, walk through from there. So I believe now you should all be seeing what is table 2 from the January consensus forecast. So what we do is we walk through, have the staff economists and others meet and present their individual recommendations for what they think the revenue numbers will look like, broken down by various taxes, and then come together to determine what the general fund and school aid fund amounts will look like for the year, and revise the current year and the out year forecasts. Statute requires us to do the current year, next year, and the following year. So that takes us from current year of fiscal year 1920, next year 21-22, and through fiscal year through fiscal year 22. So as you likely saw over the weekend or on Friday, all of our projected numbers are down from the previous amounts. The most pressing issue for us now becomes fiscal year 20, where you see, oh, this is January, isn't it? This is the wrong screen. No wonder why it looks so good. So this is January, real quick. Everything looked great in January, as I pointed out to a few folks who asked me about it.
Have another cup of coffee, Chris.
Yeah, I guess so. In January, we thought everything was good. Frankly, until approximately March, we thought everything was good. It's not so good anymore. So let me pull up this document instead. Here, I'll pull up the Senate fiscal document, since I know where that's at, and I'll find the other one in a minute. Let me share this screen, and then it may make a little more sense. So what we do is we go through. First, we'll talk about fiscal year 20. So in fiscal year 20, what we're seeing here, I'll see if I can grab a. I don't think I have annotate function. So instead, I'll just point you through this chart. So table 1 provides what we had the previous consensus amounts at for GF and school aid, and then we have the 3 estimating parties, their different amounts. We have in bold in table 1 a fiscal year 1920 revised consensus on May 15th. And then those final 2 columns indicate just how far down we've revised the estimates. So for fiscal year 20, the current fiscal year, we're revising our general fund amounts down from January by essentially $2 billion, and our school aid fund revenue down by $1.2 billion. I think, and ultimately that means we're down in revenue from our January expectations by $3.2 billion. I think if you look at those percentage changes, they're staggering is the word we've been using all weekend. I think it's true. Down 18% in general fund is a massive amount, not just year over year, but in mid-year, it becomes a significant problem for us. Similarly, the revision is equally down in fiscal year 21. So the year we'll be working to resolve shortly. The GF revenue down from January for fiscal 21 is $1.9 billion. And in school aid, it's another $1.1 billion. So again, another $3 billion down from January. The one piece that I think might get lost a little bit in the conversation, and I think we were discussing a little between the participants earlier, is you can see on this chart the beginning of some increase in revenue year over year. So while we're 18% down in general fund from 19 into 20, these projections, while still significantly down from January, show a beginning of an increase in revenue year over year in the projections. So in this case, up 2.8% from the new 20 projections, and up 4% from the new 20 projections in school aid. When we go to 22, you see that continuation again. So again, while the revenue numbers are down from what we thought they would be in January by another 1.4 billion general fund and roughly 700 million school aid, you see that those projections continue to increase again for fiscal year 22 compared to these revised numbers. So we begin to see some recovery from this kind of fallout in fiscal year 20. So I think maybe Arnold, I think Marianne's still muted. I'm not sure if she can unmute herself or not. I think Arnold might need to unmute Marianne so she can join this conversation as well.
Good morning, everyone. So the other fact that I'd point out about that, not to think that Chris was being rosy at the end, none of these numbers go back to where we were in the current year. So they are growing, but we don't reach where we are in the current fiscal year anytime soon. So
right.
That's the other sort of piece on that. That's how far we dropped. We dropped significantly,
Right.
just starting in March. I mean, this is just from March till now. So what next? So what happens under for fiscal year 20 and then 21? So we now have a number for fiscal year 20. So what are the options that the legislature has to adjust the budget? So they must adjust the budget. It must be balanced by September 30th. And there's not many months left to find a resolution. So it's my understanding the first thing that they're going to do is work on fiscal year 20. So the options are they can do a negative executive order, and that's sort of like a negative supplemental where the governor recommends reductions, general fund reductions to the legislature, specifically to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee can either accept it or reject it. They can't amend it, change it in any other way. They can only accept it and or reject it. So in my 30 plus years here, I've seen it all different ways. I've seen it negotiated behind the scenes, and it goes to the Appropriations Committee and they adopt it right away. I've seen the governor just propose an executive order and the legislature rejecting it and then having to go back to the table to do to redo the executive order. So that's I want to say the easiest way to get something through the legislature, because it only takes the Appropriations Committee's affirmative vote on that. There's also the negative supplemental that you can do, which is then goes through the Appropriations Committees and then floor votes and exchange the bill between the House and the Senate and vote on it. Most typically what happens is you do both a negative EO and a negative supplemental, because some things you can't do in an executive order. So you can't reduce the legislative budget, you can't reduce the executive budget, you can't reduce the judiciary budget in an EO, and you can't reduce school aid funds in an EO. It has to just be general funds. So you need other vehicle bills to reduce the budget. Also, you need, there's also language in the School Aid Act, specifically proration in Section 296, that would automatically reduce funding to schools. There's a whole process for that. It's based on the amount of school aid fund going to each entity, and depends on how big the shortfall is as to what the reduction would be. So in sort of behind the scenes tentative look at a proration for schools right now, so we're estimating a shortfall of about, I think, $1 billion in school aid. That would result in about $750 per pupil reduction to schools if that was to go in place. So the technical piece of that is, first of all, you have to have a shortfall that was determined at the Revenue Estimating Conference. Then the state treasurer has to write a letter to or notify the state budget director that there is a shortfall. And then the state budget director has to send a letter to the legislature saying there's a shortfall and that they are starting basically the clock on the proration. It's 30 days from when that letter is received. To my knowledge, no letter has been received or sent to the legislature at this time. So the revenue conference is not automatic on the proration. It's just a start of a process behind the scenes to do proration. also been here when we haven't had a revenue conference and we've had proration issued. So really what happens with the letter, a proration letter, it starts negotiations behind the scenes, especially within school aid fund. You do not have to do a proration. You can negotiate anything else that you want. You can put in more money into general fund money into the school aid budget. You can do partial prorations where you reduce the foundation and then a bunch of other categoricals. There's a lot of flexibility as to how you resolve the shortfall, except for that you have to resolve the shortfall at some point. I think that's close to what we need on fiscal year 20.
Great, great discussion on process. I've got a question, and I think it's important that it's made clear that we have to solve the fiscal year 2020 deficit in the next 5 months.
Yes.
Less than 5 months, is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
So we're looking at right now about, again, $1.9 billion general fund shortfall and about a $1.2 billion school aid fund shortfall.
That's the revenue. Yeah, right. That's the revenue shortfall.
Right.
So the other thing to note is on the balance sheet right now, there's about $915 million of general fund available to close the gap or the shortfall, and there's $195 million on the school aid fund balance sheet to assist in that. So between the two, Chris and I are pretty close. We're somewhere around $2 billion.
Okay.
$2.1 billion is the combined shortfall that we're talking about in fiscal year 20 between school aid and general fund.
Were those, well, obviously those funds were dedicated for school aid and various programs in general fund that will now be impacted along the way. Can one of you talk about the economics? I know we've got Dr. Ballard here as follow-up as well, but can one or both of you talk about the economics that you reviewed in order to get to this point, this consensus?
Here, I'm sure we can both touch on it briefly, and Dr. Ballard will know far more about this than maybe Marianne and I do, but you know, this was a particularly difficult revenue conference for us to come up with answers, because a lot of what we tend to use for our forecasting are the data that come in from tax returns and some of the information that becomes available over the course of a normal year, and the timing of our coronavirus pandemic is such that a lot of the information that we typically rely on has been delayed. And so the collections, for example, at both the state and federal level have been delayed from what would have normally been April information that we can consume and use for May, have been pushed off to July, which is partly why we've called for a third conference likely in August or September. So instead, we're left to look at some of the surrounding economic conditions. And so what we all discussed on Friday and staff discussed beforehand were things like the unemployment and Uia claims. You know, that what we've seen in the last, you know, again, I, like everyone else, have lost track of time to a degree, but I think it's been about 2 months now, almost 3 months now. What we've seen during that time frame are historic levels of initial unemployment claims. We'd gone from, I think, something like the neighborhood of 7,000 new claims a week until March to over 1 million claims in the last few weeks. I mean, it's just, the chart now looks like it spikes so much at the end, it almost looks like the border of the chart on the right-hand side.
Right.
So we have to point out to people that it is not, in fact, the border, it's still data. It is a staggering number of UI claims. And so seeing those sort of things coupled with what we're projecting for unemployment rates at 25, 26% in the state, you know, that helps us to better understand kind of where people are. But we also look at the surrounding items. So we look at things like auto sales, and we look at those collections that we see coming in. We see the revenue from the Secretary of State when people register their new cars. That has dropped almost to zero overnight. And so we know that that sort of economic activity that we rely on has really dried up. Similarly, we look at things like, we've been able to look at things like restaurant sales tax collection, which is almost dried up and is typically something that is it's an afterthought. This is a very flat tax collection month over month. It's just kind of always on autopilot because people are operating normally. In this case, we've lost a lot of that revenue. So we're able to look at those kind of surrounding and ancillary data and be able to project how bad things are. The ultimate question, and perhaps Dr. Ballard will be better suited to answer this, is, each of our three projections, the House, Senate, and Treasury, came with its own set of estimates on a reopening of the state and kind of how long it takes to recover. So it's the conversation on, is it a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, a swoosh, or a W, or, how long does it take to come back from this precipitous drop? And a lot of that is based on, right now, projections assuming kind of a slow opening of things. But again, if it takes us longer, it'll take us longer to pull out of this. But maybe that's a good place to turn it over to Dr. Ballard to get some of his insight.
Okay. Thank you. I want to echo a couple of the things that Chris and Marianne have said. One is, this is one of the foggiest situations that you're ever going to find. This is unprecedented. I have used the word unprecedented an unprecedented number of times in the last couple of months. And what economists do is we look at historical data and we develop models based on that, and then we kind of try to peer into the future on the basis of that. Well, a lot of our historical data are either not really available right now, as Chris was saying, or not in their usual form, or they're not relevant. And so where exactly this is going to go, you've got to put big error bars around it. But you still have to make an estimate because that's what the law says that we have to do. And so I have respect for the people in the House Fiscal Agency and Senate Fiscal Agency shop. Good people doing your best. Do you have the right number down to the last nickel? Of course you don't. But we still have to make a guess. I don't know how much you factor in to your calculations the estimates that are done by the people at the research seminar in quantitative economics at U of M. But I know that that's usually an important part, and those are folks just who for decades have done high quality work. Gabe Ehrlich and his team. I saw one of their presentations in another setting a couple of weeks ago, and I think they're probably in the right ballpark, but could they be wrong? Well, of course they could be wrong, because so much depends upon the course of the virus itself. Will there be a resurgence of, let's say that we do this gentle reopening over the next few months, will there be a resurgence of the contagion in the fall? Some people think there will be. I think a lot depends upon what we do. Couple of additional, but I guess I would say that the consensus among economists, I think right now, is a Nike swoosh-shaped recovery. Nobody's talking with any confidence about a V-shaped recovery. That is a sharp decline in economic activity followed by a sharp recovery. I fervently do I pray that will happen. I don't think it's likely to happen. More likely that we will be still making up ground in 2022, ground that we've lost in the last 2 months. One thing that I should want to note is, what did I wrote down what Chris said. In January, we thought everything was good. Everything was good in a sense. It is appropriate to remember that the Michigan economy had been slowing down since 2018. After we came out of the Great Recession, we averaged about 75,000 jobs a year added. Then in 17 and 18, we averaged about 40 some odd thousand. And then for much of 19, our economy was darn close to flat. And and I remember last summer of 2019, there was a lot of talk about the possibility of a recession. There were already systematic weaknesses in many parts of the economy. There were corporations had incurred debts that people were worrying about their ability to repay. Individual borrowers had done the same thing. There was already turmoil in some of the credit markets last fall. So I think there's a pretty good chance that we would have had a recession anyhow. It's just that nobody predicted that it would be this recession, that it would happen as a result of the coronavirus. And the other thing is, when you say, Chris, that everything was good, what that means is that it looked like we were having enough revenue coming in to meet which I'd like to, especially for the longer term, have a broader discussion about whether those commitments are proper. You know, I mean, yeah, good enough to have some of the crappiest roads of the country, because that's what we've decided upon over the last few decades. We've decided that we want to have crappy roads. I would prefer to have good roads. We've decided to slash support for higher education so that my students and their families have to pay a whole lot more in tuition than they would otherwise have. So there are bigger issues, but I guess I think it's probably appropriate that we focus today primarily on the short term. And I think you're absolutely right. I would already be scheduling your third conference because there is so much uncertainty. One last thing, almost all of this would have happened if Gretchen Whitmer had never said anything, if she had not issued any order at all. It wouldn't be very different from what we're seeing here now, because my wife and I stopped going to restaurants before the stay-at-home order. Millions of other people stopped going to the gym before the stay-at-home order. The YMCA where I used to work out was going to close down regardless of whether there was a stay-at-home order. And so I think it's important to maintain that perspective. A lot of this is driven, I think most of it is driven by the behavior of individual people who don't want to put themselves at risk of death.
And Charlie, I think it's also important to note we do have around the world cities and countries that are ahead of us in terms of gently reopening. And, we are finding already spikes in the number of cases in those cities, as well as the fact that human beings are being very cautious. Many reports out of Wuhan, for instance, obviously, the epicenter, the start of the pandemic, people are still not venturing out to restaurants, and as folks would like it to happen. So there's going to be a very gentle and a very slow recovery, no matter what occurs. One question I had as well is, Chris, Marianne, your projections, the consensus goes all the way out to fiscal year 2022, where you again say that even with some nominal growth, we'll still be behind the numbers you came up with in January of 2020. Was there any discussion at the conference on Friday, or have you two seen anything as to when we might get back to that January 2020 number at all at this point?
I don't think so. I think the focus was 20, then 21, knowing that we're coming back in August, September,
Right.
to look at, then take a better look at 22. I think really it's an outlier. We really don't have a good sense on.
Yeah. One of the things that has been noted, and Charlie noted, and you've all noted it too, and I think it is important for the audience to understand, we are operating in the dark. I mean, Charlie pointed out there are no historical reference points for this. And I know that doesn't help people's mindsets. because we all want answers. When is this going to be over? Both from a public health crisis and an economic crisis. But it is very, very difficult to determine that. And I appreciate all the work that you all are doing to try and get the best information and give the best information to policymakers. So thank you for that.
Arnold, one of the things we haven't yet touched on and probably need to is the federal component.
Go ahead.
So for fiscal year 20, and I heard over the weekend, Budget Director Kolb made several references to the federal government as well. And so I think it's important to note that right now the state has received, obviously there has been significant assistance from the federal government in a couple different capacities, but there's really two places where I think you would want to focus attention for the state itself, not so much for for individuals. And obviously there's a lot of assistance going for individuals, but for the state and the state's coffers, there's two places of particular interest. One is the change in the federal FMAP rate, which is how much the feds pick up for Medicare match. They've shifted to they've added essentially 6.2% of what they will be paying for. So the state for fiscal year 20 had allocated monies as a match for federal dollars. And now beginning in January, and at least we're projecting at least through June, the feds will essentially be picking up a higher percentage of the tab by about 6.2%. That translates, we determined at the revenue conference, we're banking on about $350 million worth of funds that the state no longer needs to put forward for that match, and can then use to offset some of the other deficit. The other large piece that's looming is this conversation about the coronavirus relief fund. So Congress has essentially passed 3 acts thus far. The House passed an act or a bill this past weekend, but the 3 that have been signed into law, the last of which was the CARES Act, and in that act is a substantial amount for states and territories to use monies for coronavirus relief. That coronavirus relief fund is expected to bring about $3.8 billion into the state of Michigan. About $700 million of that goes off the top to municipalities in Michigan with a population over 500,000. So that's the city of Detroit, and then counties of Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, and Kent. So that leaves about $3.1 billion of federal monies to be allocated by the state for coronavirus relief. Unlike the ARA funds that we saw a decade ago, these funds are, according to Treasury, U.S. Treasury, these funds are to be used only for purposes of coronavirus relief, so paying for things that are directly attributable to the coronavirus. They're only supposed to be used for things, for costs incurred from March to December of this year, and they're not allowed to be to backfill funds that the state had already been planning on, or for expenditures the state had already been planning on spending on coronavirus. The feds have, since those 3 requirements were issued, they've also kind of provided guidance to indicate that they do not intend for these dollars to be used to backfill lost revenue. So that's the piece where the states had been lobbying fairly hard for those dollars to be essentially fungible and to backfill any lost revenue, because there's some concern that perhaps the state won't have that large of a single cost for coronavirus relief itself, that the costs will instead be incurred on the lost revenue side. So that's a piece that's, still appears to be up in the air. Obviously, if some of those federal dollars can be used to offset the lost revenue, some of the budget picture looks different. But right now, we aren't really sure where that lands. I did want to point out that the state budget office has right now on their website, they've got a nice report where they publish the spending on coronavirus related activities. The state legislature provided the administration the ability to essentially receive and expend any federal monies related to COVID-19 in House Bill 4729 or PA 67. So included in that act is for 90 days, so essentially through June, any monies that come in from the feds related to COVID-19 can be spent again without additional legislative authorization. So the exchange for that was that the budget office had to provide an update on how those dollars were being spent. They're doing a very nice job of that on their website, so you can track those dollars. I think it's updated weekly in terms of
we got one today. We got one today, Chris.
So it provides a real good sense of how those dollars are being allocated. But again, $3.1 billion in that one single fund. There are other streams of revenue coming in, but for transportation, for arts, for a lot of other things. The $3.1 billion for that one single fund is a lot of money. It's a whole lot of money, and there is some concern that the state won't have that much cost associated with simply the coronavirus relief. We will obviously have that much related to the larger pandemic. So I just wanted to make sure we talked about that a little bit.
Thanks, Chris.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Because every single state is in the same position that
Exactly.
we are. And every single state is lobbying Congress for them to amend some language to allow that to happen. So the pressure is there. It's just a matter of is it going to happen and when is it going to happen?
Yeah, I think an awful lot of people in every state in the country are hoping very much that those monies will be made more, the greater flexibility will be added to that, because that could go a very long way to helping us out of this problem. Arnold, you said that I had the ability to share screen. Could I share something with?
Yeah.
This is just along the lines of, where is it? Oh gosh. Oh, there it is. Along the lines of making the point that was made earlier about all these graphs that you just can't believe, this is just a different look at that. Headline, employment in the United States, and Michigan is kind of pretty similar to the US average as percent of employment at the beginning of each of the last 5 recessions. So at the beginning of the recession, you have as much employment as you have at the beginning of the recession, thus 100%. And then here is the trajectory of the very deep recession in the early 80s, what we used to think was a very deep recession, and then a pretty fast recovery. And then here's the Gulf War recession, not quite as good a recovery. Here's the 2001 recession. This is the so-called jobless recovery that we were talking about a lot in 2003 and 2004 and 5. And then here is the Great Recession. Notice that all 4 of these recessions look extremely similar in terms of the trajectory of job loss in the United States. You're losing 1 or 2% of the jobs in the first 10 months of the recession. And then the Great Recession uncouples from all the others. That's because the 10th of those dots, somewhere in there, is, these are monthly data. There's months from the beginning of the recession is on the horizontal axis. That's when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and that led to the real meltdown of the financial system. And then you had a much deeper dive. And then this little blip was the people being hired temporarily for the 2010 census, and then a long, slow slog to get back to where we were. But ultimately, we added a whole lot more jobs up over and above what we had lost in that recession. Well, here is April this is March, if you consider that the first month of the recession, and then this is April. You know.
It's a pretty fantastic drop.
Yeah. On Sesame Street, we would ask, some of these are different. Which of these children, which of these is different? And you know, I don't know what the future holds, but it's easy to spin out a scenario based on this, that it takes a few years, at least, to get back to anything closer to normal.
And Charlie, that's a good segue into one of the questions that's come up. Someone has asked, haven't we operated in the dark before? Maybe not on this scale, but what are the lessons learned and any core principles that we can utilize from our experiences back in those recessions? Chris, Marianne, you know, you all have been around a while, as have you, Dr. Ballard. Maybe Chris and Marianne, given your experiences working in the legislature, what do you think are there any guideposts from these previous recessions that we've had to look at? I mean, I remember during the revenue conference, as I try and give you a minute to answer that, I remember you saying that the revision that was for the 2020 revision that was announced on Friday is double the amount of the revision that we had to do back for the Great Recession. So when you look at this fiscal year and the next fiscal year, the $6 billion total plus of revenue reductions is double what we had to deal with back in the Great Recession, if I'm not mistaken. I think I heard that correctly. But is there anything we've learned along the way?
Well, again, I think some of what we we talked about a little bit earlier. Sorry, Charlie?
I think I'll just stop the share. You've seen it all.
Oh, that's okay. Nobody needs to see my ugly mug anyway. That's okay. So I do think, some of what we discussed earlier in terms of looking at other data points have been helpful for us. And it's the more of that sort of data that we are able to collect, the better we are. In this case, this recession or this drop that we're discussing, we're talking about looking at open table reservations, right? We're using data so differently than we would have even 10 years ago that we're able to kind of see some of those consumer behaviors. And so in that sense, we are able to try to use additional data to kind of color in where there are holes. But it is an unprecedented number. But again, I said on Friday, while I don't love where we're at, I feel fairly comfortable in looking at the numbers and saying that they all kind of tell a very similar story. As we looked at our projections in the office, remotely from the office, as we looked at those, a lot of the various data sets kept kind of coming back to the same point. If we make an adjustment here on sales tax collections and we make an adjustment here on what we thought was going on with withholding, they seemed to line up with what we were making in terms of assumptions on unemployment numbers. So all of those different areas kind of all essentially drove us to one point. And so I think we are able to make an estimate that makes sense and that is viable. And so I think we do feel comfortable with the estimates we're making. But again, that's partly why we've also made a call for an August conference, because I don't want to host a third conference. I'm more than happy to let someone else take over soon, but we're going to have another one because we'll have more data at that point too. And it's prudent in this scenario to, even if we come back in August and say we were right on, and I hope we're wrong. I hope things are far better than we're projecting. But even at that point, we're able to say we have more information. Come August and September, we'll have a better sense of what the economy has been doing, and we'll know more about what the impact of the virus is as well, which is just such a unique scenario. The one thing I'll point out in terms of something, as we were looking back through history, the analysis we pointed to, I think we pointed it back to 1958 was the last time we've seen this sort of quarterly decline. And it was the second quarter of 1958 where we saw this, the first quarter, which tied directly to the second wave of the H2N2 flu pandemic. And so, we haven't seen things like this since then. And just interestingly, it was also connected to really something that we didn't see coming and couldn't have forecast.
And I think that's a great point, Chris, is that a pandemic, much unlike an economic crisis in and of itself, is a public health crisis. And that is going to greatly impact consumer behavior moving forward, coming out. And like I said, we're already seeing that in some of the cities and countries around the world where consumers are being very cautious about their travel, about where they're spending their time still. Even if they have a bunch of money in their pocket all of a sudden and we open up, it's undetermined how they're going to spend that money, whether they're back at work or whether it's through help from the government, whether they're going out to eat, whether they're traveling. There was a story this morning about Airbnb and what they're seeing in their cancellations. I'm sure VRBO is seeing the same thing. Major conferences are canceling going into the fall right now. So in terms of consumer behavior, it's really going to make it's going to be a challenge for you all who do these estimates to figure out, what those revenue streams are and how they're going to be impacted moving forward.
It'll be really, I'm sorry, go ahead, Marianne.
I gotta say, and also even universities for that fact, I mean, they're huge employers and they haven't decided yet what they're gonna do. And that, if that plays out where they're gonna all go online, there's gonna be even more impacts right there for those
at the
cities.
local community level.
Yeah.
I mean, for those of us living and working in this region, thinking about Michigan State University's decision, if they decide to go totally online, I can't imagine the impact on the city of East Lansing.
Well, the same will exist just for K-12 schools.
Right. Right.
I don't know yet what the plan is for schools in the fall, and that means not only is that an impact for the students and the teachers, obviously, it's an impact for the general economy. As I have a 5-year-old who's trapped somewhere in another room with mom who's on another conference call. We all as employers could potentially be dealing with staff who have kids at home at very different sort of fall than you would have expected. And so those sort of that sort of re-engagement is meaningful, and and until we have a better sense of what that plan is,
right.
We're kind of shooting in the dark. But again, we've got a really good sense of where we are today. It's a great point estimate. But that's why we want to come back and revisit it.
Right. And that is another factor, as you mentioned, Chris, a lot of reporting that I've seen talking about major corporations realizing that a certain percentage of their employees can indeed work from home now. So I think the impact on workplace and workforce and how we go about our work, that change that we've talked about over the course of many years might be greatly accelerated by this pandemic.
Right.
Agree.
I'd like to make a pitch for doing everything that we can to reopen K through 12 schools at the regular time. I'm not
just for Chris, right?
I mean, a lot of it is my stepdaughter in Ann Arbor who has 3 kids. I want her life to get back to somewhat more like normal, but it's more than that. It's that in these early years, that's when the brain development is at its peak. A child won't have a kindergarten brain a second time. They only have a kindergarten brain when they're that age, and that is an age when we can have tremendous growth in cognitive abilities, or we can allow those to languish. And if we do that, we will have a generation of children who will have been shortchanged unless we. I mean, I would advocate for doing things to make it up, to maybe have more summer going forward. But we can only do that safely I mean, no parent is going to commit their child to a school where they think their child is going to get sick. Thus, if we have limited resources for testing and tracing, I would put very high priority on devoting those limited resources to children, teachers, ancillary workers in schools. And of course, you'd have to have exceptions for children with immune disorders or something. But if we can get the schools back, that would be one of my very highest priorities. I'd be interested to hear what the others have to say.
Personally, it's a very high priority for me.
Yeah.
It does have obviously it has a rippling economic impact as well, as we've built an economy assuming that both mom and dad can be at work and Johnny and Sally are at school, and that's just not what we look like right now, and perhaps we need to change that, but that's an impact that obviously I don't get to decide, but it's something that we're going to watch play out in real time.
Right. And I think schools are looking, from the people that I know that are part of schools, teachers and administrators, they're all looking at how to do fall, whether, there's unlimited, partly online, partly in the classroom. How do you social distance these big buildings and classrooms? And, I think they're being very creative right now, because I think that's where the goal is also.
Right.
Yes, if there's any group that is being as creative as we are trying to be in terms of our forecast, the administrators for schools, there's certainly not a playbook for them here. So they are, from what I'm seeing, doing a really incredible job trying to figure this out.
And it's fascinating. Last night, I came upon an article on ESPN Online on Major League Baseball's 67-page playbook of protocols for going back to play. And you really get a feel for how complicated those protocols are and will make life. I mean, we were sitting at home and talking, and I read through these, and I think each of one of us that were here said, I wouldn't play. It's just unbelievable, the protocols. So if you want to understand, and I think it's important that we do understand how complicated this situation is from a public health perspective, even as we are anxious to get back to daily routines and live our, quote, daily normal lives as we knew them on February 1st or March 1st. We do have to understand how complicated it is. And I can't imagine what K-12 administrators and those in that industry are having to contemplate in terms of, bringing children back to school and the social distancing that will still be at play, and how you do classes, even at a university level where we have 200 and 300 students in a class, especially some of those entry-level classes. Thankful that our research labs are now starting to get back to work. But, large universities like Michigan State, University of Michigan, with large classrooms, it's going to be a challenge. And for those that have already said that they're having in person, it will be interesting to watch what their protocols are and their setup is moving forward. Any other comments from anyone? I've gone through the questions here. I don't see any other questions in our Q&A box or our chat box. I know that Chris is on a tight time frame here. Any other, Chris and Marianne? Marianne, you did an exceptional job early on of the process. Since our folks here on this webinar are legislative staffers. Any other thoughts from Chris and Marianne to the legislative staffers that we have on today in terms of what to expect or how they can prepare their members for what might be coming?
So the one thing we really didn't touch upon was fiscal year 21, partly because I think you got to really do fiscal year 20 before you can do fiscal year 21. But the two questions sort of looming out there is there's a July 1 deadline, statutory deadline. And then there's really the real deadline, which is September 30th, to have a budget in place for fiscal year 21. So that's what we're going to first watch to see what happens in 20 and see how 21 plays out, whether we're going to go towards a July 1 deadline to put something into place. And even if we did put something into place, it's going to be readjusted again after that August, September revenue conference at some point. And so I think that's sort of the next steps after the fiscal year 20 budget, as to sort of what to look forward going through there.
Right.
I think I'd just make the plug, both Marianne and I have websites where all of the consensus information is now on our websites.
Right.
Our staff are available. I think right now the real key is communication. We've been really trying to make sure that information is available to members and to staff. We will continue to try to do that. But if you've got questions as staff, if you're hearing something that just doesn't seem like it's something you've been hearing from us, feel free to call us and ask. We're happy to try to make sure to get you the information you need. And we try to be proactive on that front. But when you've got questions, please contact our offices. My team are all remote, but we are, I think, busier than ever. And so if you contact us, we'll be able to help you through whatever questions you've got.
Okay, great. I think I'd push if you email is probably the quickest. You get the quickest responses if you shoot an email to us, and then we can make sure all of your stuff is answered.
So I think those are great points. Charlie, from your perspective, from an economic perspective, what should we be watching for in terms of signs of, oh, this isn't going as well, or hey, that's pretty good, whether it's employment numbers or whatever it might be over the next couple of months?
Well, one advantage of the employment numbers is that the unemployment claims come out weekly, and the jobs report comes out monthly. That gives us the more regular indicators that we have, the better. The GDP, they don't really put it together except on a quarterly basis, and so there's more of a lag. But I think we also need to be watching the coronavirus data on new cases and deaths, because that's what's going to drive this. We will not get back to really normal until we're vaccinated, and whenever that is, and we won't get back to quasi-normal until we've got enough distancing, enough testing, enough tracing, enough quarantining to get the virus more or less under control. So I'd be watching those. One other point that I'd like to make before we stop is, I really do hope that we can, through the budget stabilization funds, through additional flexibility from the feds, through whatever, I hope that we can reduce the extent to which we have to lay off state workers, or and the ripple effects from the state budget on down to the local budgets. Because if you lay off a teacher, or you lay off a custodian, or anybody else of the thousands of people who work in state and local government, then that's one more casualty of the economic downturn. That person then will have less to spend, and then that will cause ripple effects that will work their way through the economy. I'd also like to give a shout out to Marianne and Chris and your teams, several of whom are former students of mine. I mean, we've seen in recent months, we've seen the important role that people like Dr. Anthony Fauci play. That these people who are usually behind the scenes, but dedicated professionals who are trying to do the best job that they can. And I know personally a number of people in the House Fiscal and Senate Fiscal, and I'm proud of the work that you do in very difficult circumstances, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie. Appreciate it.
Well, I want to thank everyone for taking time over the past hour to talk about the budget issues. Chris and Marianne, you made it clear that you're available to help staff with their questions. And I want to, as a former legislative staffer myself, I want to urge staff that if you have questions, to do contact Chris and Marianne for the information, peruse their websites and see the information that's out there. So thank you all for being here. Thanks to Cindy Kyle of IPSR staff for helping put this together as well. This session has been recorded and will be posted in the next day or two. And we will let all those who attended know that when it is posted. Our next session, following up a bit on what Charlie ended with on the virus itself and testing patterns, testing opportunities, issues like contact tracing with professionals from the medical field, will begin at 1 p.m. So we hope that we hope to see those participants back at 1 p.m. So again, thank you very much, and appreciate everyone's time this morning.
Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you.